Hello and welcome to the Illinois Wesleyan University Titan Talks webinar series. I am Adrienne Powell, Director of Alumni Engagement, and I'm very pleased that you all are joining us for this very necessary conversation tonight. We welcome your participation through the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many questions as we can. Along with all of the Titan Talks, this will be recorded for viewing at a later time and posted on the IW Alumni Association YouTube account. So please subscribe in order to be notified as new episodes are added. We are honored to partner tonight with the Department of Biology and the Environmental Studies program. Thanks so much to Karen Peterson for taking the time out of her busy schedule to teach us about her work. Professor Gibbon Harper will be moderating this evening. So I know that we have some students in the room and also alumni. So thanks everybody for joining us. Just a little bit about Professor Harper, if you don't know him. He's an ecologist with diverse research interests, currently supervising students who are investigating the distribution and habitat preferences of American badgers and Plains pocket gophers in McLean County. In addition, he is supervising students who are determining the species of breeding birds and their habitat preferences within the city limits of Bloomington Normal. So thank you, Professor, and I'll let you introduce our speaker tonight.
Sure. Well, good evening. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the presentation that's co-sponsored by the Office of Alumni Engagement. And we're delighted to have as our speaker this evening, Karen Peterson, who graduated from Illinois Wesleyan in 2007. She was a double anthropology and Hispanic studies major. So I have some very fond memories of Karen when she was a student in my tropical ecology course in Costa Rica. And it was quite a thrill to hike through exquisite rainforests and see just an incredible diversity of organisms. And I do remember at one remote field station, we would be awakened each morning by howler monkeys that were calling in the trees behind the station. Those memories. And I think experiences such as these help propel Karen and other students on their intellectual journeys. So Karen has a very impressive career path, which she will discuss tonight, but I'll briefly summarize. After graduating from Illinois Wesleyan, she served in the Peace Corps in both Peru and Honduras. She received a Master's of Environmental Management from Yale in 2013, and then she served as Program Officer of the Forest and Climate Team of the World Wildlife Fund from 2015 to 2019. And then since 2019, Karen has served as the Climate Change Project Manager for the Illinois chapter of the Nature Conservancy. The title of her presentation this evening is Tackling Climate Change, and there'll be time for questions afterward. So Karen, we're delighted to have you back at least virtually on campus for a presentation.
Thank you so much. And I also remember the first time I heard howler monkeys, and the first time I heard it with my husband, he thought it was a jaguar. So I was glad that I had already heard them before. So hi everyone, I'm Karen. Thank you so much, Dr. Harper, for inviting me to talk today. I hope everyone is hanging in there during these strange times. So, you know, as the title suggests, and as Dr. Harper explained, I have been invited here today to talk a little bit about my career path, but also the topic of climate change. And so I'll start off with a little bit about my background before talking more broadly about climate change, and ending with some more information specifically about the climate change work I currently do with the Nature Conservancy here in Illinois. And as everyone has mentioned, I'm happy to take questions on any part about my career path and or climate change or current work at the end of the presentation. So starting with my academic background, as a student at Illinois Wesleyan, I came in very undecided. For all intents and purposes, I'm still undecided. I have a lot of different interests, but I happened upon anthropology, which I liked because it allows you to basically study anything. And it really wasn't until after college that I decided to pursue environmental work. But it so happens that a background in social science has actually been very helpful for me as an environmental professional. Even though science is a critical component of environmental work, there's no doubt that humans are such a central part of environmental work that social science provides a very strong understanding of that and has been very beneficial to me. And I do just have to say, like many, I was very disappointed by the university's decision to cut the anthropology department. I have very fond memories of the classes I took with Dr. Springwood and Dr. Gerhardt, and they will definitely be missed. But I also took quite a few science courses. All environmental work is science-based, so having a firm understanding of scientific concepts is important. And if nothing else, taking some science courses as an undergraduate keeps your options open down the road. And finally, it was at Wesleyan that I was first exposed to environmental studies and ecology. As Dr. Harper mentioned, I went on a really influential trip to Costa Rica, a May term trip, which sparked an interest that continues today in forests and ecology. I also studied abroad in Ecuador, where I did a special project on tropical dry forest conservation. And since then, I found myself back in tropical dry forests, actually, time and time again. And I ended up doing work related to tropical forests in both grad school and in my previous job. And I really do encourage students to expand their horizons beyond the classroom by taking advantage of opportunities to study abroad if you can, but also just opportunities to volunteer with local organizations while you're in college. I also have a Master's in Environmental Management from the Yale School of the Environment. My experience has been that advanced degrees are not required, but are very common and are required for most positions in the environmental field. So having a master's or a PhD or a law degree is very useful if you're considering an environmental path. I decided to go to graduate school after taking a few years off, well, a few years of working, which is something I generally recommend. Not only is some work experience useful for helping you decide what you really want to do, it also helps you get the most out of grad school. And grad school is one of the easiest ways to pivot in a new direction. So if you found a new interest, that it's sometimes useful to wait until you've had some experience out in the world to see what you really like to do. And that's actually a good segue for me to talk a little bit about my work between college and grad school. I know that if I had gone straight to grad school, I would have ended up in a very different field. I know at one point I was really interested in getting a PhD in nutritional anthropology. Probably would have been interesting, but not what I do now. My interest evolved after being exposed to new experiences. As Dr. Harper mentioned, I was a Peace Corps volunteer for 2 years in Peru, followed by a year in Honduras. And in both countries, I worked in very small communities on the edges of protected areas. And I was working with the communities to do small-scale sustainable development. I really loved the work and probably would still be a Peace Corps volunteer if I could. For me, this work also was what sparked an interest in really pursuing an environmental career. For many professions in the environmental field, almost nothing can replace this kind of experience too, particularly working in international policy years later. My experience working in developing countries really provided me with a realistic and grounded sense of the kind of work that's possible and also the kinds of barriers you might face. Especially with policy, it's good to have a sense before you just embark on creating random policies to really know what might work on the ground. And as a result, I would really recommend getting on the ground experience when you're starting out in a career. And it doesn't have to happen overseas. It could be AmeriCorps, it could be with a local community group or ecological field work, really anything involving on the ground work. After Peace Corps, as I said, I went to grad school, but then my first full-time job was with the World Wildlife Fund. And I worked on a team that worked at the intersection of tropical forests and international climate policy. Probably most of you know that saving tropical forests is a critical part of climate change work because tropical forests store a huge amount of carbon, but they're also being cut down at alarming rates and also burning as a result of climate change in part. In my role at WWF, I was primarily focused on policy research and strategy development. The exact details of how the Paris Agreement will be implemented were, and actually still are, being negotiated. So in this role, I tracked the negotiations and really tried to find key ways that we could influence the way the final document of the Paris Agreement would be implemented that would be advantageous for tropical forest conservation. And this job really, I think, was a great job, and it really was most beneficial to me in giving me a very real sense of the importance of always considering the global context of climate change, even when doing very local on-the-ground work. Even though I really enjoyed my work at WWF, I was looking to do US-based climate work and to do work more directly tied to on-the-ground activities. So about a year and a half ago, I took a job at the Nature Conservancy and relocated to Chicago. And I was hired as a first full-time climate change staff member for the Illinois chapter of the Nature Conservancy. They were really looking for someone who could help better define a niche for TNC in Illinois. And so I will spend more time talking about TNC's climate change work at the end of the presentation, so I'm not going to go into more detail about my role now. So that's my background in a nutshell. Happy to answer questions at the end, but now I'll switch gears a bit to talk more broadly about climate change. So I will start by providing some context on the current climate situation, including some information on how climate change is expected to touch down in Illinois, followed by some explanation about the scale of action required to successfully tackle climate change. And I will conclude with a few slides about my work that I'm currently doing at the Nature Conservancy. First, I'll provide some basic context so everyone is on the same page about the current path we're on regarding temperature rise and potential paths forward. Notably, we have already experienced 1 degree of warming globally owing to human activities. Climate change is already happening. We are already feeling the impacts. The fires in the West this year are a perfect example. To avert the worst impacts of climate change, we need to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is the goal of the Paris Agreement, which aims to keep global warming to below 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. Even at 1.5, we can expect to face serious impacts. Yet, with current policy, we are headed toward a rise of at least 3 degrees, at which point impacts are assumed to be catastrophic and irreversible. This graph really just provides another way of understanding these facts. It shows what the global average temperature is expected to be for various pathways for greenhouse gas emissions. So hopefully you can see the circle here, which is trying to highlight that if we stick to our current policies, which is the brighter blue path, which is more or less a business as usual scenario, we should expect around a 3 degree temperature rise. Now, if we move to the lighter blue path, you can see that even if countries implement all of their current commitments under the Paris Agreement, so their emissions reductions targets, etc., which would be a big achievement actually, because there are some pretty big commitments, we will still see around 2.5 or more degrees of warming. Now, to actually achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and to keep warming to a 1.5 or 2 degree rise, emissions need to drop very steeply in line with the green and yellow paths. While the differences between these numbers, just 1.5 to 2 degrees, might not seem like a big deal, even slight differences in global average temperature matter. To illustrate, even limiting warming to 1.5 instead of 2 degrees is the difference between the number of people susceptible to poverty by up to several million people. So just those little incremental differences could have huge impacts to people and ecosystems, etc. And for me, these graphs are sobering because they show that despite the exciting progress that is being made, like technological process for developing new renewable energy or political progress, for example, signing the Paris Agreement, we still are not on track to keep global temperatures from exceeding dangerous levels. Mentioned earlier is a path with cap. So what does climate change look like here in Illinois? This graphic depicts how we expect the climate to change under 2 scenarios here in Illinois. The yellow path is probably most consistent with our current policy environment. In this case, Illinois will end up with a climate like Arkansas and parts of Louisiana by the end of the century. Now, if we truly fail to act, Illinois summers would end up feeling more like Houston, as shown by the red path. In general, and this is no surprise, Illinois will be hotter under both a moderate emissions and a high emissions trajectory. As you can see from this graphic, where moderate emissions are on the top and high emissions are in the bottom row, the differences are particularly large by the end of the century and really drive home the importance of mitigating climate change as much as possible. Even under a moderate emission scenario, Illinois could experience between 50 to 75 extra days over 95 degrees by the end of the century, which doesn't seem particularly appealing. And whereas the end of the century is a long way off, it may be beyond some of our lifetimes, most of our lifetimes. Some impacts we are seeing sooner than we anticipated. For example, the Western fires that we're seeing this summer. I was just reading today that scientists expected those to happen 30 years down the road. So some of these impacts could happen sooner. There are just a lot of unknowns with climate change. We will also generally get more precipitation, though it won't be evenly spread across the year. As this graph shows, we expect the timing of precipitation to change, with much wetter winters and springs, slightly wetter falls, but drier summers. And this kind of change is particularly relevant to farmers, for example, given that heavier spring rains could delay planting or even prevent planting, and drier summers could impact things like plant growth and maturation. We also expect to see more heavy rain events, with rain concentrated in shorter periods of time, for example, within a particular day or week. And both trends, rain concentrated in certain seasons and rain concentrated in shorter bursts, will increase the risk of flooding in Illinois. In general, and this is the good news, is that Illinois is actually likely to fare better than other regions. This is a snapshot of an image from a recent ProPublica article, which represents data on how climate change is expected to shift the areas most suitable to humans. It shows that by 2070, if we more or less stick to our current policies, Illinois is predicted to fall within the most suitable zone for humans in the country. Interestingly enough, though, the previously suitable zone was more in the south, like say across, like if you just shifted it basically through the mid section of the South. But that has been the most suitable range for the last 6,000 years. And by 2070, we're expecting a pretty large shift. So things are happening quickly and really starting to disrupt systems that have been stable for thousands of years. And so I just want to say, though, that even if climatic conditions in our own backyard remain stable, which they may, or more or less stable, it doesn't mean we're out of the woods. And it certainly doesn't mean we're off the hook in terms of needing to act. Even though Illinois might be less at risk than some regions, Illinois will still be affected in many ways. For example, we will still experience negative health impacts, particularly from increased heat exposure and also increased exposure to vector-borne diseases from ticks and mosquitoes. We should expect increased competition for land and resources as people from the coasts and southern portions and western portions of the country move inland and north. Some bird and plant species, which are adapted to very specific climate niches, will fail to adapt, while many pests and invasive species will thrive and expand their ranges. And for a state like Illinois, this is a problem, especially because our resilience of our ecosystems is already particularly weak, because we only have a small amount of native habitat remaining, and what does remain is pretty fragmented, or very fragmented. We would also expect the economy to suffer. Just the ag economy alone, we expect to have negative impacts, as we do expect corn and soy yields to decrease as a result of climate change. And finally, and I think this is a very important point, it is critical to understand that climate change will exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. It will invariably have the most harmful impacts on communities that are already the most vulnerable, like communities that currently experience higher rates of poverty and discrimination. This includes both rural and urban communities, and this is true globally, but also in our own backyard. The last point about equity and disparate impacts of climate change is a good transition to talk about our respective responsibilities to act to mitigate climate change. Because climate change is a global phenomenon, there's no inherent correlation between where the most emissions are produced and where the impacts of climate change will be the worst. So whereas the impacts of climate change may be more moderate in Illinois than other places, really just due to the quirks of geographic luck, Illinois is a heavy producer of greenhouse gas emissions. As a result of being heavily populated with lots of industry, we produce the 7th highest amount of greenhouse gas emissions from energy use in the US. We also live in a country that is a heavy emitter. The US is second only to China in terms of the quantity of greenhouse gas emissions produced. And importantly, it is only in recent years that China started to produce more emissions than the US. So cumulatively, our historical responsibility is the largest in the world. Our cumulative emissions represent around a quarter of all emissions ever produced globally. Without a doubt, the US has the largest responsibility to lead on drastically cutting emissions than any country in the world. Unfortunately, the US has failed to lead on this issue in the last few years, rolling back environmental regulations and going as far to withdraw our support for the Paris Agreement. And the more we delay action, the worse the outcomes and the more expensive the solutions. Now we'll talk about what needs to happen to get on track to realizing the goals of the Paris Agreement, specifically focusing on what it will take to keep global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. To realize the 1.5 degree goal, society needs to achieve a 45% decline in CO2 emissions by 2030. And it's really easy to gloss over this, but it means we need to cut emissions nearly in half in the next decade. If we just think about how much has not been achieved in the last 4 years, which is nearly half a decade, it's easy to understand just how quickly a decade can pass us by. Beyond that, we need to continue reducing emissions to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This means we have 30 years to drastically reduce emissions to near zero and balance out the few residual emissions that remain with so-called negative emissions or carbon removals, basically removing carbon from the atmosphere with currently non-existent technology or planting trees to suck carbon out of the air. And the net zero term is pretty complicated, and there's just no time to get into the details of that at the moment. However, the most important takeaway is that achieving net zero really does hinge on deep and immediate reductions in emissions across all sectors. Although we certainly may benefit a small amount from being able to remove some carbon from the atmosphere through technology or planting trees, we can't count on carbon removals alone. Also, a common misconception with the term net zero is that existing emissions can be balanced out with carbon offsets, which I'm assuming most of you are familiar with. And carbon offsetting is a common strategy for many companies and institutions. This graph is useful because it shows that simply offsetting emissions is not in line with achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. In the graph, the gray bars represent emissions and the blue bars represent offsets, which are being purchased to, quote unquote, balance out emissions and achieve net zero. But the purple line shows how much a company would actually need to reduce their emissions to be on track to achieve net zero. In short, you really cannot buy your way out of climate responsibility through things like offsets. Everybody has to be focused on the most important thing, which is emissions reductions. Carbon offsetting and the fact that it simply won't cut it as a climate strategy, given the urgency of the need to reduce emissions, is a good example of how the status quo and strategies that maintain the status quo will not suffice to successfully mitigate climate change. We need complete systems change. And this doesn't mean that everything we do and every aspect of how we currently do things needs to change, but the kinds of changes we need to implement can't be done if we just make incremental changes or small tweaks at the margins within existing systems. Rather, we need to do things like rapidly scaling up investment and passing new policies to incentivize the development of new technologies. We need to eliminate the use of fossil fuels and switch to renewables. We need to ramp down consumption, improve the sustainability of food systems. We need to halt deforestation and land use change, especially in the tropics. And we need to address existing inequalities. At the same time, we also have to be investing in climate change adaptation because we know that we will see changes that we will have to address, even if we were to halt emissions today. And we can all do things in our own lives to start to address climate change, and that is important. Like things like, and that can vary with the person, eating less meat, consuming less, flying less, and there are all kinds of ways. But at the end of the day, a significant portion of the impact we can have really comes down to the policies and the systems we support. And I wanted to talk about just how vast climate change work is before talking about TNC's climate work specifically, because I really think it's a critical thing to understand and acknowledge that solving climate change requires a society-wide effort. If climate change is siloed as an environmental problem, we will fail to adequately address it. And the problem is too large and requires changes across everything from financial systems to food systems, which means it isn't something traditional environmental organizations can tackle alone. And even TNC's work really just scratches the surface. But despite the daunting nature of climate change, it can be heartening to realize that if we do take action to tackle climate change, it can lead to benefits that extend beyond just solving the climate problem. Research has shown that pathways that emphasize deep and immediate emissions reductions rather than delaying action and reducing emissions later are much more likely to create an equitable and sustainable world. So if we act on climate change aggressively, we're also more likely to address existing inequalities and to lighten the overall human impact on the natural world with benefits to biodiversity and conservation. And although those with vested interests in maintaining the status quo and pushing climate change action down the road often balk at the cost and the high expense required to achieve deep and immediate emissions reductions, we also know from research that investing in climate change action now will pay off and is actually much cheaper than failing to act and facing the economic damages of runaway climate change. So before I wrap up, I will provide some information on the work my organization is doing on climate change here in Illinois. TNC does work on climate change around the world at all scales, from local to global. But today I'm just going to give an overview of the work we're doing in Illinois specifically. The program is very new, so we're still in the initial stages of getting work off the ground. But we have tried to identify areas of work that fill in the gaps or complement important climate work that other environmental organizations are doing across the state. So the strategies we've identified aren't necessarily exactly the most important things that Illinois needs to do to address climate change. They're just what TNC can bring to the table in terms of doing our part to complement climate change work. And we have 4 main strategies, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail. Our first strategy is centered on building bipartisan support for climate change action, which is important given how divisive and partisan the topic currently is. Case in point, just last week, the current nominee to the Supreme Court called climate change politically controversial. So at TNC, at the federal level, we're trying to influence conservative members of Congress to support climate legislation. At the state level, we're supporting the process of passing ambitious climate legislation through work with a coalition of groups called the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. And we're also working to engage new constituencies with a focus on the agricultural sector. It's interesting because if you talk to most farmers, they will instantly and even enthusiastically acknowledge that the weather has changed, but the majority of farmers still don't acknowledge climate change, at least not openly. Our work includes developing a local climate assessment, which we're developing in collaboration with mainly professors from the University of Illinois, to better communicate the impacts of climate change to communities in rural Illinois, integrating climate change messaging into existing outreach to farmers and grower groups, and engaging our traditional agricultural partners in new ways. We already work with farmers on things like soil health and water quality, and so we are using those relationships to start talking more about things like climate change. We all know to address climate change, we will need to vastly scale up renewable energy. And that is something we most definitely support wholeheartedly, but there is always the thing to be aware of is that the amount of renewable energy we need to see could have negative impact on natural areas if we aren't careful about planning. And so from an environmental and social perspective, it's beneficial to prioritize the siting of new renewable energy in areas with the fewest adverse impacts to habitat, wildlife, and ecosystem services. TNC has actually done some very good mapping on this, pulling together a lot of different resources and research to create a map for wind on the plains, including Illinois. And we developed a tool called Site Wind Right, which helps guide low impact wind siting. So a wind developer can use the map to try to select a site for development that will avoid the worst impacts to nature and wildlife. And We support, as I said, the rapid upscaling of renewable energy. We just want to see that it's done right and responsibly. So we are working to promote the use of tools like Site Wind Right, and also working to develop further guidance for low impact solar in Illinois. And we are also advocating to incorporate this kind of guidance into policies for clean energy in the state of Illinois. We are also working to encourage the uptake of natural climate solutions in Illinois. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, natural climate solutions are efforts to conserve, restore, or sustainably manage natural or agricultural lands as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Planting trees is a good example. Realistically, the largest opportunities to use nature to mitigate climate change are actually in the tropics. So avoiding deforestation and reforestation in the tropics are two very big ways to use nature as a key strategy for mitigating climate change. In the States or in temperate zones, the opportunities tend to be a lot smaller. That said, it's still worth promoting a couple of sustainable agricultural practices in Illinois that can avoid and remove emissions, and that is especially the use of cover cropping and also efforts to reduce nitrogen use. And even though these benefits, they're almost like a co-benefit from a climate change perspective. They might have a somewhat small opportunity from a climate change perspective, but we also know they have very large benefits for soil health and water quality. So this is a strategy that kind of spans a couple of different areas of work for TNC. Some of these practices are already being employed by farmers, but they are at a very small scale. So cover crops in Illinois are only used on about 3% of Illinois farmland. So there's the big opportunity to scale it up. And to do this work, we'll be working to create the policy and incentives to encourage the uptake of these practices at scale, and providing direct support to farmers to make the transition to using these practices. Our fourth area of work is related to climate change adaptation, with a focus on reducing flood risk in urban and rural Illinois communities. In Illinois, flooding is actually one of the biggest risks that communities face with regard to climate change. We already actually have very large costs from flooding in Illinois. It fluctuates with the year, but certainly a couple of years back, we had a pretty extreme flooding, and that's expected to get worse with climate change. And in some areas in particular, nature can be used very effectively to enhance resiliency, helping to reduce flooding. In rural areas, smart land use planning can be used to identify priority areas for floodplain restoration and reconnection in a way that can really maximize flood storage and decrease flood risk. So for example, you can take marginal cropland out of production and all of a sudden you have a huge flood storage area, not to mention you can restore wetlands and critical habitat. And then in towns and cities, natural infrastructure in the form of bioswales, rain gardens, and tree planting is also a low cost and effective approach for tackling localized flooding, as well as helping to improve urban heat islands and poor air quality. So we are aiming to expand our work on climate adaptation in Illinois and to improve our reach in more communities across the state. It's something we're already doing a little bit in Chicago and also through our traditional floodplain conservation work, but something we're looking to expand with a stronger climate adaptation angle. So that sums up the work we have planned for TNC in Illinois. This is a broad summary, but I am happy to answer more specific questions at the end of the talk. And I'll leave you with this quote by Howard Zinn, which I'll let you read. I included this because working on climate change can often feel kind of hopeless because the problem is so big and complex and mired in a huge political mess. But even though I often feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problem, I think down deep every environmentalist has to be an optimist. This is my working theory, or else we just give up. And I think there is reason to hope that humanity will pull through, because over the course of history, humans have achieved remarkable things, but it does take work and it demands change. With that, I'll go ahead and wrap up. If anyone has questions about any part of the presentation, I'll do my best to answer. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Karen. So we do have questions in the chat. John Wilmus, certainly interested to know your take on the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement without getting too political. How do you believe this will affect the end result of the agreement?
That's a very good question. You know, since I did used to work very closely on the Paris Agreement negotiations, it's also something close to my heart. I think I was actually in Washington, D.C. I was still working in Washington, D.C. the day we pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and it was a sad day, because I think so much had gone into getting to the point where we got, you know, it marked the first time that every country in the world was willing to sign on to a climate agreement. And it's not perfect, it's not binding, but it was a huge step forward in getting everybody at the table willing to agree on what had to be done. And I think without the US being at the table, you risk a lot. You risk other countries pulling out. You risk other countries who may have felt pressured to achieve ambitious goals, weakening their goals, or creating goals that are really deceitful, like Russia's an example, or Brazil's an example. If you don't have the US at the table, they can dominate a negotiation session. And you kind of need that balance of the US being at the table and being serious about climate change to make sure that the end result isn't weaker. So I'm hopeful that we will rejoin the Paris Agreement. There's part of me that thinks every country will just forge ahead without us, because so far that's been what we've seen. But there's always a risk that without the US at the table, the Paris Agreement would kind of just crumble and we would eventually need to renegotiate a new agreement. But I think time will tell. If there's a new administration, that will be one of their first actions, is to make sure we do not fully pull out.
Okay. Steve Sebring. So as we think of the totality of our energy needs, it's hard to imagine renewable energy as the sole source. So what role should nuclear power, which is completely clean, play?
This is a tricky question. There are a lot of different opinions on this topic. I tend to think that in an ideal world, we'll find a cleaner solution than nuclear, just because of the waste. Like, we haven't come up with an appropriate solution for disposing of nuclear waste. But I also think that with current technology, if you just took nuclear out of the system at the moment, you would be signing up for, you wouldn't be able to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, for example. Like, you need, especially in a state like Illinois, we produce a huge amount of nuclear. If you just took that out of the system, we would need to get energy from somewhere, and we're not prepared to meet that demand just with renewable energy. So I would say that until there's some technological breakthrough, the existing nuclear needs to be part of our energy mix.
Okay. Tom Hillebrand, is there any part of climate change in the Midwest that involves more severe winters?
Well, I do think now you're really getting into climate science, and I'm not a climate scientist, but I do know that the polar vortex, for example, that phenomenon that we've seen is related to climate patterns. And so with climate change, I think there are all kinds of reasons we started calling it climate change, some political, but part of why climate change is an apt description is because the changes we see can vary depending on where you're at. And so they can be kind of unexpected, one of them being something like a polar vortex where you get really bitter cold, even if you're in a year where you saw increasing global average temperatures. So certainly you can see that, but there's certainly no expectation that winters would be consistently and on average more cold, because that just wouldn't be possible with temperatures rising. But you could get incidents where you had extreme weather that was colder than average.
Yeah, I remember quite well that polar vortex a couple of years ago that was rather severe. So I'll just read a comment from Rebecca Mafazi. Hi, Karen. So happy to see you. Thank you for your wonderful presentation, for your important work making a difference. And a comment, I'm impressed by the role that environmental justice plays in your work. It draws attention to the fact that while climate change affects us all, it negatively impacts those already experiencing inequalities more. So here's a question. I'm a big fan of the Emequon project in Fulton County. It's at the foot of Dixon Mounds Museum and has great value as an important site of Native American historical and cultural value. How important will that wetland area and the Illinois River Restoration Project become as climate change more greatly affects Illinois? I'm thinking of the floodplain restoration you mentioned in terms of restoring critical habitat. Any insights you have are welcome.
Yeah, and that's a really great question. And it's actually something, I also think Emequon is a great site, and it's managed by TNC. And so I've spoken to Doug Blodgett, who is the aquatic ecologist and the manager of that site, about this specific question. And I think it took me a while to wrap my head around what Doug was trying to explain, which is that Emequon is not managed for flood storage, which is what you need if you're trying to reduce flood risk. So Emequon is an interesting site where they can control the flood levels, and they actually can draw down flood levels to emulate what would have been a more natural occurrence on the Illinois River before it became so contained. And so their management of that site is really about managing for particular species, and the main focus is not flood storage. So if you just did replicated sites like Emequon along the river, it wouldn't necessarily maximize the benefit of flood storage. That said, it does take some water out of the system, and so it does have some flood storage capabilities, but you would need to amplify that so many times to get the kind of flood storage that might actually reduce flood risk, that the benefits for flood risk reduction in particular of Emequon aren't huge. They're not non-existent, but the main management purpose is not for flood storage. I tried to explain that. Hopefully it made sense. Happy to try to explain it better if it didn't.
Okay, a question from Leah Benak. Two questions. So does TNC offer internships for recent graduates? And have you learned any strategies such as using certain language or real world examples that are particularly effective in getting people to treat climate change like the crisis it is?
That's a very good question. So with regard to internships, TNC definitely does have internships, and probably some of them, actually I think they do have a program for recent graduates, but I think it's not operating right now just because of COVID. I don't know that they're doing any new hires or the same internship program, but it's always worth checking the website. I think TNC has a jobs website, and that would be the best place to look. And then one other thing I would say is that in my experience, for example, when I started at the World Wildlife Fund, I had worked in Peace Corps for nearly like 3.5 years. I had a master's degree and some consulting experience after. And when I took my job at WWF, I actually started as an intern. And that was with, you know, several years of work experience and a master's. And it wasn't like I was the only one. The only interns that WWF accepted had at least a master's degree. And I only mention this not to discourage you, but just to say sometimes the largest environmental NGOs are looking for very qualified candidates who already have work experience. And so it can be very valuable to set your sights on more local organizations when you're just graduating. You shouldn't not apply to some of the big NGOs. I just mentioned that so you don't get discouraged, so you know who the kinds of candidates you're competing against. Like, you shouldn't feel bad if you don't get an internship at TNC, for example, if you know the other candidates have a master's degree. But it's certainly worth applying. So anyway, that's just one thing I learned that was kind of eye-opening when I entered the workforce. And then your question about climate and communication is exceptionally important. And I think, you know, one thing, I mean, I have learned a thing or two, but it varies so much based on who you're talking to. For example, farmers are a good example. We have often talked to farmers about climate change by just starting out talking about the weather. You know, climate or climate change can be a trigger word for some because it's been so politicized. So sometimes you just have to work around it and use words like weather. It can be hard for me because climate change is literally in the title of my job. And so that can be a trigger right from the start. That's interesting to work around. But just in general, another thing, it's not about language in particular, but in the marketing work or marketing research that TNC has done, it's often that population or communities trust very localized information, which is part of why we're doing a climate assessment using researchers from the University of Illinois, so that farmers or people who trust University of Illinois information can look and maybe trust that climate change science more than they would trust Purdue's climate change science. It seems silly, but you know, you have to find ways to convey information in a way people will trust it. I'm sure there are all kinds of other marketing examples. I mean, I know the more you can tell a story that resonates with people rather than just spewing science at them, which is what I just did today to all of you. But you know, that's my approach. But the more you can tell things as a story, I think the more that resonates with people too.
All right. Question from Emily Lozano. Do you think it's important to implement policies to control human population?
I mean, I don't even know how to best answer that question. There's no doubt that population pressure plays a role in how we consume and how we use resources and leads to higher emissions. But I don't know that there is a way forward in creating human population policy that would be, you know, acceptable to at least to the majority. So it's definitely not something that TNC dapples in, but so it's also not something that I have a very eloquent answer to. But I definitely think, you know, there's every reason to believe we shouldn't just massively populate the earth, but we should, you know, I also just don't know what a good policy would look like.
All right. Leslie Coleman, for those of us who are hoping to work long-term in the environmental field, what words of wisdom can you offer on avoiding burnout and maintaining passion?
Full disclosure, Leslie's actually one of my very good friends from college, and I know Dr. Harper knows her well too. And Leslie works at the DOJ and has a very intense job in the environmental field. So I think I was just talking about this with my partner earlier, who works at EPA. So we talk a lot about work after work. I think, you have to find a way. Well, let me start again. I have even recently realized that, I'm not sure, like, I'm in the perfect job at the moment, but I just try to pay attention to the actual day-to-day tasks that I really like to do. That's something that can be hard to know when you're getting into a job. You can be really passionate about the topic and the actual, the technical information or whatever it is about the topic that interests you, but then you get to a job and you're sitting at a computer and you're planning an event or you're doing something that really isn't your, what drives you. And so I think, though, you can try to pay attention to what you really like to do on the day-to-day as a way to keep your career moving in the right direction. So something that I recently realized, I should have realized a long time ago, but it took me a while, is that I actually really, really like doing research, like in-depth book research, academic research, and you're writing about it. And I think a more research-focused job would probably be an ideal job for me, whereas someone else is going to love a marketing job or a legal job or a teaching job. And so I think just paying attention to not only the topic, but really what you want to do every hour. And you won't be able to do it every hour of every day, even if you're in a job you love. But paying attention to that is important to keep you going, I think, and to make sure when you look for the next job, you get that much closer to something that's really sustainable and keeps you interested every day.
Yes. For me, it's watching birds. So I'll finish out. What do you think is the most important thing that Illinois Wesleyan students can do about climate change, both here on campus and nationally?
Yeah, well, I really think, and maybe I kind of alluded to this in my presentation, there's probably nothing more important you can do as a student than supporting candidates, as in political candidates, who are going to support the kinds of climate policies you agree with. So, being politically active, voting, just being aware of the kinds of policies that are out there is probably one of the most important things you can do. Of course, you can also take action in your daily life. Something my sister did, Kelly Peterson, when she was on campus, you might have seen there's this like little tiny bit of prairie outside of the cafeteria and outside of the science building. She worked really hard, probably with support from Dr. Harper, to get that little patch of grass converted to prairie. And I think, there are things you can do to advocate for. What I'd love to see is if more of Illinois Wesleyan's lawn were converted to prairie rather than mowing it. But, that might be a contentious issue. But there are things you can advocate for the university to do. I know when I was a student, I was a member of the Sierra Student Coalition, and Leslie Coleman, who made the question earlier, was very critical to getting the university to sign onto a declaration committing us to be more engaged in climate change work and to reducing our own emissions. Every institution can be pushed to do more. And so as a student, I encourage you to respectfully, push your institution, your university, to try to be the best, local and global citizen it can be in terms of taking actions to reduce emissions. Like if a new building is going to be built, make sure it's sustainable, things like that.
Yeah, so actually, Illinois Wesleyan was just named a B campus.
Oh, nice.
University, yes, so that is nice.
That is excellent.
Well, I thank you so much for your presentation and for answering questions, and certainly I wish you the best as you work on this important issue.
Thank you. And I really appreciate you inviting me here today. And, you know, for students, if you want to reach out after the presentation, I'm also happy to talk to anyone.
Well, I echo Gibbon's thanks to you, Karen. This was a really exquisite conversation. I so appreciate your work and how you made the information so digestible for those of us who aren't scientists. And I appreciate you giving back to Illinois Wesleyan this way. Well, I'll be looking forward to watching your work as you continue. Thanks also to those of you who asked really great questions. I hope that you will join us next week for the next episode of Titan Talks. We will be speaking on next Tuesday night at 6 p.m. To hear from a panel of educators and hear how they are rising to the challenge of COVID-19. Thanks, everyone. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and vigilant. Go Titans.
Thank you.